Zarin Aloush is one of the top rebel leaders in the Syrian civil war, and he was killed by, some say, a Russian airstrike, and others say just a Syrian government airstrike. So this happened just recently, and the U.S. is not very happy about this, and some Western analysts are not very happy about this. But this is actually a perfect time to show you how deep the rot of propaganda is on the issue of Syria. So listen to how the New York Times described this rebel commander, and then I'm going to tell you the reality about him. So this is what they say. Unlike harder line armed groups, the Army of Islam, which is the group that he led, has shown a recent interest in taking part in politics. Mr. Aloush had a history of sectarian statements, but after meeting with American officials, he softened his tone. His death was described as a big day for supporters of ISIS and the Assad regime. So they go on to describe him as like, hey, he had his problems, push it under the rug, but don't worry, he was anti-ISIS, so moderate rebels. He's a moderate rebel. These are the kind of people that the U.S. can do business with and work with, and we can use somebody like this to topple Assad and then do regime change and move on from there. So, what's the general sentiment you're getting from these excerpts from the New York Times article? And by the way, you can go read the whole article. There are parts where they're slightly more clear about what this guy really is. But these statements are troubling to say the least, and I'll explain exactly why in a second. But again, the general sentiment you should get from this is moderate rebel. There are some headlines that say, the peace process in jeopardy in Syria because this guy was killed. So he was one they were going to use to do a transition government or do a shared power government with Assad to try to get an end to the civil war in Syria. So this is how he's being portrayed in the West, in our various media outlets, and the New York Times of all places, which sometimes does a decent job. What's the reality on him? This guy called for the cleansing of all Alawites and Shias in Damascus. Out and out called for genocide. They have his quotes. He's like, yeah, cleanse it of Alawites and Shiites. And that's what Assad is, by the way. Assad is an Alawite and a Shia. And, you know, the people who are fighting for the regime, as they call it, for the government forces, Alawites and Shias, many of them. He's like, kill them all. Moderate rebel who we can work with. This guy gave a speech on the importance of the Hajj, and in the speech, he praised Osama bin Laden. Again, this is a guy who Western media outlets, the U.S. government, and many people just accept, no, he's a moderate rebel. Why is he moderate? Well, he's not ISIS. Congratulations. You want a fucking cookie? Are you kidding me? That's what it takes to be called a moderate today? Well, he's not ISIS. Well, by that logic, I guess you could say al-Nusra, which is al-qaeda in Syria, I guess they're moderates too, right? But again, I say that like mockingly, but General Petraeus floated that idea to Obama in a meeting, on the record. He's like, why don't we arm al-Qaeda? Because al-Qaeda might fight ISIS. Good. And then also al-Qaeda will fight Assad. Good. You want to arm the people that attacked us on 9/11. You want to arm people who are jihadists and they're telling you they're jihadists. You want to make the same mistake Reagan did with the Mujahideen when he armed them and they became the Taliban and al-Qaeda and used those weapons against us. You think if you arm al-Qaeda, they're not going to eventually use the weapons against you? How fucking stupid are you? You have to be the dumbest person on planet Earth. So this guy, they say, nope, even better. More moderate rebel. He's the head of the Army of Islam. And he spoke to us once or twice and told us what we wanted to hear. Therefore, he's a good guy, even though he called for genocide against Shias, even though he praised Osama bin Laden in a speech. By the way, he also took part in a well-known massacre of civilians in Syria. And let's keep everything in perspective, too. A lot of people will say, wrongly, Assad killed 250,000 people. That's what he did. Flat-out propaganda, totally not true. Don't take my word for it. Go look at the numbers compiled by all the respected human rights groups, Amnesty International, the UN, you name it, and the casualty rate is about 50-50 between the rebels and the government forces. And both sides have killed civilians. And I'm not defending it on either side. I'm against killing civilians across the board. But just know that when people say Assad is responsible for every death of a civilian in there, that's simply not true. That's not true. These are a lot of the rebels. ISIS, one of the biggest rebel groups in Syria. Al-Nusra, which is al-qaeda, one of the biggest rebel groups in Syria. The Army of Islam, the one that this guy was the head of, one of the biggest rebel groups in Syria. They praised this guy as a moderate. I got more for you. Not only did he take part in a massacre in Syria, he kidnapped human rights activists. Stay classy. And when asked to clarify comments on al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and people who he's praised in the past, he said, no, did I stutter? Al-Qaeda is, quote, our brothers. So, go ahead, tell me what I told you. Tell me what I told you. I've gotten so much shit for my position on Syria, but anybody who's actually read about Syria and looked at the articles, gotten into the details instead of just taking what other people have said that you just say, that must be true because that person said it. How about you read the nuance and the detail of what's actually happening in Syria, and then you'll realize very quickly, oh, wait a second, the rebels today are almost all jihadists at worst or Islamists at best. And all the so-called secular moderate rebels, gone. They fled to Turkey. They fled to Europe. They're nowhere to be found. There's like 8 FSA dudes left in there. And a lot of the FSA dudes have truces with people in the jihadist groups because they say our bigger enemy is Assad. So what are we going to do? We're going to make the same mistake we made in Iraq? Today, everybody says about Iraq, well, we shouldn't have gone in there because Saddam Hussein, as terrible of a guy he was, he stabilized the region, and it wasn't our business anyway to go in there. He didn't attack us. He had nothing to do with it, with 9/11. So why would we have toppled him? And then what came up out of the power vacuum was worse. And today, we say the opposite about Syria. We got to support with some of the rebels. Find the rebels to support, because we got to topple Assad because he's such a bad guy. And then I guarantee you, whatever takes the place of Assad is not going to be worse and is going to be something that fills the power vacuum that's like a jihadist or an Islamist group. Oh, yes, it will. Of course it will. Of course you're going to have the best organized and most aggressive rebel groups in the region are all jihadists and Islamists. Now, you can hate Assad. I got no problem with you hating Assad. But the idea that if you topple him, it's going to make the U.S. more safe, it's not. It's not. He's fighting ISIS. He's fighting the rebels, of course, by definition. They want to topple him. But the real reason why we're against Assad is because Assad is backed by Iran, our enemy, and Russia, our enemy. So, you know, we don't like the fact that there's an ally of those guys in the region, even though that ally is the leading force fighting jihadists. But now we're like, well, it's not that clear because we don't like them there because we're against Russia and Iran, so arm moderate rebels? Who are your moderates, bitch? This guy is their moderate.